Dialogue shapes learning. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement and a little bit of information about DDNRC, and then I will hand it over to our presenters today. We acknowledge that we are all sitting on Indigenous lands, ancestral lands, and unceded lands of Native peoples. We invite you to consider the lands on which you reside and work. We invite you to reflect, to know the histories of Indigenous peoples, and to know the current and present state of Native peoples in your regions. If you know the lands on which you reside, we now invite you to note that in the chat. And if you'd like to learn more about land acknowledgements, you can check out the DDNRC webinar from February 2022, which is available on our website. A little bit about the DDNRC before we get started. The DDNRC is a national organization made up of folks who work on dialogue in higher education, and we seek to contribute to transformative change among higher education professionals and institutions and their partners by advancing innovative dialogic practices to address the multiple and persistent challenges to justice and equity in our society. We think of dialogue as doing several things. We lead dialogues that help to advance justice, foster transformational change, and promote equity. And this is, of course, a set of interrelated activities with reciprocal impacts on each other. But this is our model of change for higher education through dialogue that promotes equity, advances justice, and creates change in our institutions. And we invite you, if you're not already a member of DDNRC and you'd like to learn more about our work, to continue joining us, but also to consider joining the organization and becoming a member and getting more involved. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Jen Ball from Clarkson University, who's going to introduce herself and her students and tell us a little bit more about today's workshop.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everybody for being here. We're going to be going over introductions of the main attraction, our speakers today, and we're going to talk a little bit about what they perceive of as dialogue and how this is impactful in classes, some of the pros and cons of using dialogue in those learning spaces, thinking about dialogue as a tool of learning within STEM classes, reviewing some of the research that they were able to do and some of their personal experiences as well. And then we're going to have some moderated questions with them and some Q&A from you all. So as we go through this, I know we typically give people a, hey, here's how we start, give yourself some reflection. As we start into this and into the introductions of our speakers today, if you could think about times where in a classroom setting, you wish that the dialogue or the discussion had been able to go deeper, involve something more of a personal experience from the students, and ways that you could see that enriching learning. Just keep those things in mind as we go through this today. All right, can we go to the next slide? So really happy to have with us our panelists. Emily Green is an engineering and management as well as project management major and minor from Clarkson University. She'll be graduating this year. She was actually one of the research for the slides that you are seeing today. Lily Gillette, who hopefully will be joining us shortly. She's a political science major, law studies minor, and also graduating this year. Savannah Pierre is an innovation and entrepreneurship and supply chain major at Clarkson, who is currently in a class, but also has been involved with the DDNRC for a few years now. And then we're being joined by Preya Patel, who is a medicine student at Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine, graduating in 27, and Joey Puel, who is an osteopathic medicine student at Orlando College of Osteopathic Medicine, graduating in 29. And they've worked with Manda on several different types of dialogue as well. So we're going to get a really great, rich student experience. And then myself, Jen Ball, who was the course instructor of History 328. So we're going to dive into that. So a little bit about the class. History 328 is actually a history of transatlantic gender and sexuality. And so we use the Atlantic transatlantic space to talk about, compare, and understand both differences and the ways that the combination of Europe, the Americas, and Africa created different understandings of gender and sexuality. And one of the things that I decided to do in this class, and frankly, the class did a fantastic job with, was using dialogue to deepen the learning, to understand difficult topics, to bring it into a modern perspective, and to relate it to their own lives. And so we'll discuss that a little bit more. And so this was really done not only for the mutual benefit of the students, but for me as well to get insight into how the students were perceiving these things and how that enriched everybody's understanding. So one of the final things they did was actually do a research project on using dialogue. It got some survey information about that and presented it to others at the university in order to get feedback how we did that. All right. Now we're going to go on to the next one. But before we start this, we wanted to give Joey and Preya a chance to talk about how they used dialogue in their time. Um, so, Joey, Preya, how are you using dialogue?
Um, I mean, I'll definitely say that in our time there at University of Florida, we used so many different formats of dialogue specifically fit for different contexts, and tried to keep involved like any stakeholders, especially the students we usually involved, or any staff and faculty that join, to kind of have a say in what our structure overall was. But overall, the main thing that I think kind of got to the core of it was just trying to facilitate a kind of sense of community, of shared values, and knowing where to begin to start really dealing with an issue, not just kind of thinking of like just a single problem, understanding it in the context of everybody involved with it. But I'm sure Prey has more.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention that for us, it was co-curricular programs. It wasn't a class specifically. And so we ran it among students from different corners of the university for our series. And then we also had one with the physics department, which was very cool. It was students and faculty from the physics department. And then we also did some one-off dialogue sessions with different corners of campus. So we really got to bring it to all these different folks.
Right, that's really helpful. So, what you're seeing here, what is dialogue? This is what the class chose to pull out and talk about. So, in our class, we actually, I love, Joey, what you said about community. We really were able, I think, and Emily, feel free to comment on this, is that I really think that it helped us develop more in a community way. Whereas in so many typical classes, you kind of sit there, you're your own person. And so these dialogues helped to do that. Is there something that you were thinking about with that, Emily?
Yeah, so I think like one of the main things that at least I noticed with this class is like when we all walked into that room on the first day and we you expected us to do this this dialogue but about a specific event and none of us wanted to talk. And I think by the end of the semester we were able to all like have these open and honest like conversations, and I think that's really a big part of the community growth. So yes, we went through and did all of these different dialogues throughout the semester, but I really think in general that it just helped us feel closer to each other and feel more comfortable, not even only sharing stuff in the class, but like I know personally I've been able to like have dialogue in other classes easier now since
Can I jump in with a question, Emily? Could you say just a wee bit more about why everybody didn't want to talk at the beginning?
then. I don't 100% know, but I feel like it's a typical thing when you first start like a class and you're sitting there and like you're nervous. Like you don't know what other people are going to think about you or what other people are going to think about your opinions. So like having that safe space to share, knowing you're not going to be judged for having specific opinions rather than like a right or wrong, it's more like, oh, I can see where you're coming from. This is where I'm coming from. It's not like people getting mad at each other. It's actual genuine conversation after a while, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the
Thanks.
look I got when this was first mentioned, they were like, "You're going to make us do what?" So as you look at these types of dialogues, we did do those, but actually this is almost in reverse of what we did. We started with pair and share, and then did mini dialogue, and then we did, and Libby, this is actually through your inspiring me, is we did a modified version of structured, the objects, right, circle
Yeah,
of
yeah.
objects. And the reason we did that is that what we told people is find an object that is personally relevant to you that relates to gender or sexuality. And that really brought that personal group together right away. People saw the human being and they were able then to understand that everybody may have a stake in this. And so that created a lot of just I would say respect, recognition of the dignity of each other, and it helped a lot. And then we did do one online after we'd gotten into it because we wanted to see that format, but Fishbowl was actually the last one that we did. And that was because I think fishbowls take a high level of trust and comfort. And so that's kind of why we went to that one last. Um, but this was some of what we did in the class, and I will vary this based on what's happening in the class. Emily, Savannah, are there any of these actually that you think of as ones that are good strong lead or things that you're like, these are the high risk ones when you're working with other students?
So personally, I felt like the mini dialogue one to start was a lot easier because it was such a small group and we were typically paired with people we already knew well enough to like have those conversations. But I definitely think as we got towards the end and we had this fishbowl discussion, like you're you're reaching out about something like that your sure like your section or idea you thought about it to a much larger group of people, so like it was kind of more difficult to do that. But I definitely think like the working its way up through the stages made it easier for us. I know on the online we did the online dialogue discussion, and during that we also talked that that seemed a little easier too for some of us because you weren't necessarily like sure you have to look at your computer screen or look in a general direction, but like when you're in a room and like it's just you talking to other people, like it's a lot easier to look at a screen full of everybody's faces rather than like trying to like scan for body language and for other things like that. So if that makes sense, I guess.
It's definitely hard to like think of like one that usually like kind of comes to problems because it's so just like contextual based on like what kind of group we have. Like for example, I did like first year classes and I would go in and I would do like a mini dialogue with them after doing a whole like PowerPoint on what dialogue was, how it was useful, what skills it could help you develop and stuff like that. And I feel like especially from that I learned the importance of icebreakers because it's people have such a tough time it seems to go straight into those circles just to be able to speak up and to I think it usually comes down to fear of conflict, honestly, more than anything. It's just people don't really want to feel like this class could be any more anxiety inducing than it might be for some folks, especially when it comes to speaking up in the first place. So yeah, I do like the mini dialogues, especially if I know I'm going to see them again, or if we're going to run through multiple topics, or we're going to go deeper into a topic, starting with something that like they can't even imagine having conflict with other people about, right? So for example, right, we often talked about imposter syndrome or something like that, which
Mm.
was it was very to a degree vulnerable for some folks, but rarely was it that anybody would really get into it with anybody else around that because it was just so personal in your experience and how you personally interact with these structures that it just felt like an easy way to get people to start talking, and then from there we can get into like stuff where it takes people to be like in a brave space, right, to be able to voice things that they know might get dissent and pushback.
Building off of that, I also really liked using like the structured objects as like a first dialogue in a series because I think it helps reinforce this idea that everyone is participating and no one is a spectator, and it does it in a very like subtle, like actionable way instead of you telling everybody and making someone feel singled out. It just establishes this pattern right off the bat that we're all going to share.
Preya, you've actually just hit on something. I tell my class at the beginning of class, I may be one of the most benevolent, manipulative people you're ever going to meet because it's those things that you build in and they don't realize it. And then you debrief it and talk about it afterwards. And it's a really great point. Joey, loved what you were saying about the icebreakers and the things you did. We did set up community guidelines before we even got into dialogue, and I did present many of these things in PowerPoint slides, as well as interspersing it with subject matter like lecturing, so that people are aware. Generally, gave people a lead of about a week or at least a class that before they got into something, so that they weren't just like, "Hey, today I'm springing this on you." But so yeah, I really appreciate what you were saying there too. All right, Samantha, do you have anything? Or are you good with the what you've heard at this point?
I was just gonna mention, I think the objects one is the best one to introduce students into dialogue rather than mini dialogue. I feel like that's easier for students to use active listening, but mini dialogue also opens up to like over speaking, and you have more of the students who are comfortable with a communication talking over students who aren't as comfortable with communication. And then I feel like fishbowl takes on, it's kind of harder for active listening just because if it's a bigger group, some people kind of like zone out. But I also feel like it gives people the confidence sometimes to speak as well. I feel like specifically in our class, basically like nobody raised their hand trying to talk first. But once you have the first person starting to talk, then you kind of get like the stragglers that come along and like join in. And I feel like that's where like fishbowl kind of helps the most.
Okay, I think we can move on to the pros and cons here. So in terms of the pros, which is our next slide, these again were created by the whole class saying we believe these were the things. So I think we've heard some of this encourages engagement, meaningful discussion between classmates, can be more dynamic and interesting way of learning and discussing topics in class. You need to put your ego aside because giving your students permission to be able to say things like that is really important in figuring out what is and isn't working in class. And they're right. Listening to a lecture is less engaging than having these interspersed dialogues. So really good points. Develop critical thinking and communication skills, creating that positive and accepting environment and allowing for clarification and understanding of a difficult conversation or a difficult topic. um, People don't want to appear wrong, but if you give permission to be inquisitive through dialogue, you really get a lot of fantastic insightful questions from students and the willingness to tease things out in real time. What are your thoughts?
I feel like that's definitely what is just so clear to see if you're in a room with like an active dialogue going on, right? It's like it's just people are when there's a good dialogue happening, people are leaned in, like everybody's body language is like just actively listening, trying to kind of be inquisitive about each other. And that's something that I just really like about dialogue. It's that kind of approach that I think is just necessary to everything that it kind of stands for. We always use the image of like the elephant, right? With the everybody's like holding a different side of it and all blindfolded and being like, oh, this is a snake, this is a tree trunk or whatever, right? It's like we all interact with systems at different, every single variable is different for every single person, and as a result, we think that that's reality, but reality is the sum of all of those, right? And so it's my favorite part about dialogue, especially for people that feel like they had fairly secluded or just kind of like very like classic American WASP suburban kind of upbringings, is that you can like see them see the world in a different way through somebody else's lens as you're hearing them like kind of share their experiences and vice versa. That I just think is something that I've only really seen to such a degree and to be like such a common kind of occurrence successfully in dialogue.
Oh, go ahead, Emily.
One thing I was gonna like bring up, like especially discussing like the pros of this, is one thing that Professor Ball had us do. She asked us to create our own syllabus. So doing this really like, and this was one of the like first day things. This was probably our first dialogue, if that made sense. And I think, well, right off the bat, we were all very nervous to talk because we didn't realize like that she was going to allow us to like actually do it. Like we were kind of like, oh, okay, so like should we try to do this? Should we try to figure it out? And I think like one of the main things that like came out of that was like the general understanding of like we all want something to be mutually beneficial. So like allowing people to discuss that as well as discussing it like from our side with her side to like find something that worked best for us was really helpful. And I think that can be applied to a bunch of different environments, not necessarily just creating your own syllabus, but like negotiating like something at work or like any of those kind of things, if that makes sense.
I think sometimes dialogue would also help think through ideas without like being defensive. I think that when you have to debate, a lot of the logical for debating in class is to really think through ideas and get to like understand why a perspective is a certain way or how someone formed their perspective. But I think in dialogue, when you do it, it's a lot more collaborative. So you don't quite get as defensive, and in some ways that lets you get to the heart of the topic a little more deeper than you would if you were debating somebody.
Sav, you have anything or I was going to comment. Okay. It's you all just brought up a couple of things that I actually, Emily, I forget that I do that. That I have you do that. And actually I loved that you pointed out people were still afraid even when I supposedly gave permission to talk because there's a script, there's a formula we expect with professors, and you're like, where's the trap in this? And so you have to have patience to like let it develop, right? Because you still feel like if you just say something, the professor's gonna judge you. So like if you're the one doing this, you really do have to be patient and let that play out. And you know, Joe, you brought up a really good point about like getting to know people differently. Like our school's a predominantly white institution. It's in a very rural space, but we have students who have literally gone to places like we call them hyphen schools, where it's K through 12, right? And there were 40 people in their graduating class, right? Yeah, Emily, right? And then there's students who grew up in urban environments and suburban environments, and their class, one of the three high schools in their district was like 1,500 people, right? And so really, even within the class, you're negotiating both inter and intra group, right? And learning to appreciate differences even within the intra group too. So really good point. Absolutely. Yeah, these are just some excellent pros that I hear you all talking about here. Anything else before we talk about some cons?
I think like the main pro that we also like hit on a lot, especially when we were like presenting this at the Project Expo at the end of the year, was how like useful it was for us to learn in this like aspect. So like Clarkson is a very diverse school when it comes to majors. There's engineers, which is typically very lecture based, like you get told this is right, this is wrong. We have healthcare majors, we have business majors, we have communications majors. So like I think the main thing that we learned was or tried to push was for the more engineering side of things to dip in to this idea of dialogue in the classroom because we all benefited a lot from learning by discussion, and that can be very useful in other settings too if it's done right. So like applying that to a class like fluids, like maybe you have a time where you sit back and you know work on an assignment with a group of people and you discuss why you should do it one way or why the other. And why that can be so important for your learning, because teaching somebody something helps you remember it way more than you just sitting there watching it, writing it down.
With you mentioning the engineers as well, it did remind me of something that I think is pretty big, and that's like the way that dialogue can kind of help our understanding of like especially social sciences and the relevance of like certain like structural issues that we talk about and how we kind of embody them. That I especially notice with like STEM folks. Where people come in and it's very very mechanistically materialist, like I'm not really thinking about patriarchy in any kind of way or any kind of systemic force of oppression or whatever that could be affecting my own behavior or how my career works. We're very rational and logical, and that's how you do things, without realizing all the ways that that's been affected by a million things, right? And the thing about dialogue is that it's because honing in on a particular topic and having all these experiences around and telling people outright, I'm not here to listen to your evidence. I'm here to talk about the books you like, maybe some of the books you've read, but not all the books you read. We can talk about your experiences, about things you've lived, and that particular lens. There's a really great way of just kind of like stretching across and just encouraging interdisciplinary thinking of this how do social structures and pressures and these huge systems that we all see in a million different ways impact my own life and the people I know and my family in little minute ways also differently. And once you zoom in on all those things, it's like, okay, how could we also change and address these things that I just feel is like such a natural progression of dialogue any time that I've been a part of it.
Really good point. All right. Are we ready to talk about the there can be cons moment? All right, let's go into that. So one of the cons is, and I think this was alluded to by Emily, is that someone's got to step up and share first, right? So that others can get more comfortable. We do build that into the way that we do it. I'm sure you do it in when you structure a dialogue for peers too, is that we have passing. We say, hey, here's where we're going to start, and we'll go from there. I also am very forgiving, but it does take that. And if you can't get that point, you have to be ready to do something about it and move on. Otherwise, it's really difficult. Anxiety about sharing your thoughts. Not everyone's going to be able to do that right away. And it can get harder to engage in the dialogue if you feel like you're never the person who speaks up. So definitely something. There can be difficulties if someone struggles to articulate their thoughts or feelings on a topic. Um, Sometimes it's just really difficult to get it out. Um, and actually, if you get a class where people are sharing more easily, if you're the one who has a problem not sharing easily, that can put more pressure, right? Um, Controversial topics, you got to be careful. If you don't balance that, it can be heated arguments or it could spill outside the class, and you really want to think about how you deal with that. What for all of you, when you look at the cons here, do you think about or would you add to that?
I think I would add that it takes time. Like it's not the same as when you're pushing information through a lecture. This is pulling information and getting people to engage and kind of take control of what they want to learn more about. And all of these things, Amanda, if you want to put this in the chat or hop in, I'm going to butcher it, but she had this quote up in her office that was something along the lines of like relationships move at the pace of trust, or I'm going to rely on her to really put that in there. But the sentiment of it is that it takes a bit to make that trust and to form that group dynamic. And so you really have to be patient. And if you're, thinking like in a couple of sessions, they're gonna have all this information and you'll be ready to evaluate them, then that's just not how this works.
There's definitely like not a lot of just being aware of your audience that is required. Um, because obviously we want diverse and intergroup dialogues, but I found especially if it's like a more serious topic and everybody's at different levels across, it can be really difficult to kind of maintain any kind of like through lines sometimes. In addition to uh, there's this kind of paradox of tolerance thing sometimes as a facilitator, right? Okay, like, somebody misgenders somebody else. I'm like, okay, I can't have that, but now there's this perception of participants of like a power dynamic that occurs at some points in time that I try and minimize and maintain people to have feel like this community and they can freely share their thoughts. And so it's a lot of like this kind of like little micromanaging to maintain a particular environment where people want to talk that is pretty difficult sometimes.
So Amanda was able to get that in if people want to see that, but Emily, go for it.
I think like the most like the one that hits me the most and might be the one that I helped put on the slideshow um, is the whole anxiety about sharing your thoughts as well as like what people's thoughts towards you after sharing those thoughts are. Um, like I know personally, like sometimes I'm very like shy to share my opinions with people because I don't want people to judge me without actually getting to know me based on one belief I have. So I think it's like really important to like while like facilitating for someone to be like let's listen to people's opinions, but let's not let them define them because like one opinion doesn't mean you have a bunch of other opinions. Like it shouldn't be just like, oh, this person thinks this, so they're this. Like that's not true. And it's just like one like important thing. And I know like especially being like here at Clarkson, like there is a lot of like people that have strong beliefs and that will be like put you in like this like ideal box after you say one idea. So like I think it's very important to like try to encourage people to be open with their thoughts rather than just being confined.
So what do you think? Like, in terms of cons, what are the hardest things sometimes? And we've been doing this largely in small classes, right? Like 20 to 30 people. Yeah. So Savannah's in the room next to me with glass in between us. So that's why we're doing these weird pointing things.
Um, I definitely feel like when it comes to cons, I feel like bullet point 4 is like one of the strongest. To follow up what Emily said, I do agree. Like the students here at Clarkson really follow their values and believe like what they think over what other people think. So if you're sitting down for a dialogue, and for our class, which is social documentation, we're usually speaking about real world issues. If you're sitting across someone who their mind is so structured on what they think and they won't move away from their opinion, it's kind of hard to have dialogue in that situation just because emotions are involved and then it'll kind of move us away from active listening and more of like of a debate instead. So I feel like that's one of the biggest cons, and I can't really think of any additional cons than the ones on this list.
That's a really good point. And one of the things that I do early in the semester is I put up that grid about debate, discussion, and dialogue. Yeah, Joey, you know what I'm talking about. This is really a good one to show people that they have. And Preya, you actually referenced this when you were talking about the collaborative and dialogue and, like those different reasons you use different things. But Savannah's right, it can absolutely slide. And sometimes to mitigate these cons, I'll actually start with like if we're going into a controversial subject or something like that, start with a crumble and commit where you let people write things down or use an anonymous poll so that people know these opinions are in the room and how do we explore them in ways that allow us to see that, really that kind of Laura method of listen, affirm, respond, add to what you're doing because I do think it's important when you're exploring certain issues to be able to have all these multiplicities without it getting into debate, but also for people to truly kind of understand why people are holding those things. And they may hold it on this issue, but it may not be a through line to something else like Emily was talking about. Other thoughts on this? All right, why don't we get into some of these moderated questions I have for you? All right, so we've got these quotes here, right? I can confidently say that I will use dialogue in my future job. In an internship, I would have to use dialogue at the end of the program to present what I have done in the job to a panel and the workers of the company, right? So I think it's really important to see that. They saw how to use this beyond their class. Dialogue is essential to the engineering design process, specifically the brainstorming section, since ideas are only as good as how you communicate them. Each member of the team must bring forward their general idea for the project and eventually form an agreement on what to do, what to go on with. Um, Dialogue is often needed to make sure that the method or solution for an engineering project is the best and safest solution. Additionally, it is important to use dialogue and presentations to allow the audience to stay interested and ask questions if necessary, with the presenter mainly being a facilitator. Um, I believe that dialogue in this field is a necessity. Dialogue could allow people to combine their knowledge and skills to better solve a problem. Dialogue could be used in the actual field since it creates a positive environment which allows for all ideas and opinions to be heard. Reading those out, what strikes you all the most in terms of thinking about dialogue in those STEM spaces? And I know, Joey and Prey, you actually use this with a physics class and department. So please, let's hear what you all have to say.
It's especially with the physics, engineering, or like, pre-vet, pre-health folks. I find that something about the knowledge of dialogue in their future careers is kind of this imagining it as like a step of a larger just kind of information gathering process for any kind of thing. That whenever you have multiple people whose lives are impacted by something, dialogue is essential to find out in what ways it affects them and to understand it before we can really move forward. And I really appreciated that perspective from the physics folks, and it seemed like a lot of the people that we worked with more regularly with the physics department kind of started to see it in that way sometimes. It was like, we have this current problem in the physics department. Let's sit down and get dialogue about it before we even start thinking about possible solutions. We have to understand how it affects people currently. And I somewhat resonate with that. In addition to that, like, I really like how much it seems like they've internalized dialogue as just a communication skill as well, and what it takes to be like on teams, which everybody is pretty much going to be.
I did that thing, which we all make fun of me for. I didn't come off mute. Right. Emily, you were part of the group that actually went through and decided on these quotes. Was there anything that as you were thinking about this, because I think one of the things I thought was really interesting is we were using this in a history class, and the majority of the students in the class would not have been history majors, right? But they really found it relevant to their own fields and like where it would be useful. And so you all said, hey, can we talk about this in a STEM setting and not a history setting? And came up with this. Is there anything you want to say about these quotes and the survey that you did?
Yeah, so the majority of this came from our class. So I think there's only one history major in our class.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I was like, I think there's only one. And the rest of us were taking this class kind of as like an interest course or as a knowledge area, which is something required to graduate from Clarkson. And I think like a lot of times people take these knowledge area courses and they don't think they're learning anything beneficial to like their future necessarily. But I think in this class, like we all thought that like these deep, meaningful conversations and learning how to have them was like super beneficial towards our future rather than just like learning about a specific topic, which I'm not saying the topic of history and internet sex is bad, but it's just like it's just like a lot of people will not use that in their future, theoretically. Should they think about it? Should it be something that everyone learns? Yes, but theoretically, like it's something that I think the most important part was that we had these discussions about different things, about gender and sex, about history, about current events, about everything. We learned how to talk around sensitive topics. And I think that's something that's super important, like in an engineering aspect. Like I'm in an engineering world. Like I worked for a pharmaceutical company last summer, and there was a lot of like uncomfortable conversations that you have to have. And I think that just having this experience of talking about uncomfortable topics to some people gave all of us like a leg up on our future. And I think like pulling some of these quotes out, like we really wanted to highlight like how it affected people's future, how it affected people individually, rather than just like, oh yeah, like I learned dialogue. Like what did learning dialogue do for you? And I think that was the goal in this like survey that we did at the end of the year.
I love the survey that you did. Oh, sorry,
No,
Savannah.
you're go ahead.
I was just gonna say, Emily, I love this survey that you did because I think sometimes people think that the humanities and the sciences are like these mutually things that don't exist together. And so seeing people find value in dialogue in STEM and kind of carrying that skill through is definitely essential. Especially I've found when you get into graduate programs or jobs where in a lot of these fields, like hierarchy is such a strong component of how systems work, and it can be really intimidating to advocate for yourself within those hierarchies or to provide a perspective that might be different than the way that the group is going. And so having these skills kind of gives you the confidence where you might not be like the highest ranked person, but knowing that you can go into a meeting and say something simple as like, here are my goals for the meeting. What are your goals? And like kind of give yourself a little bit of structure that helps build the confidence to be able to speak up in situations that would otherwise be really intimidating.
Savannah, why don't you give us your thought, and then we'll move into the Q&A with the audience.
I was just gonna say, I find the results of the survey really important just because this shows that engineering students appreciate dialogue and effective communication. And I think in Clarkson specifically, they're the students that receive those soft skills like the least. I understand as a business major, it's a lot of group work, a lot of talking to each other, and the engineers that I have met just aren't that strong in that specific field. They aren't that good in effectively communicating, actively listening. And even with my internship, I worked with GE. I was surrounded by a bunch of engineers, and you could tell that they never like actually communicated effectively with each other. And I think that it's nice that we have these classes that kind of introduce us to these things and that we can actually bring it from the class to the real world.
That did remind me of something too, of like this especially for impact for me, but I've seen it in plenty of others of our community agreements and the act of just like making intentional decisions on like making sure that we are like conversing in a way where we're actively listening, being empathetic, and um all of those little skills, like not making I statements about like being aware of just kind of uh the way in which we're like sharing our opinions to not be like kind of anti-conflict, but also not being combative. It's all these various things that I feel like I saw people in these dialogue groups embody a lot more when I saw them later out there. And there are tons of people I know that I saw like after my first year classes and said, "Oh, I've been doing that like using I statements thing instead of saying like you know how you feel this way." And I've been getting I've really been feeling like I've been communicating more effectively and like I've been listening to people better because of it. And I'm like, yes, you know too.
Terrific. Okay, Samia, do you have Q&As that you would like to put to the group?
I personally have some questions. Anyone is allowed to add questions into the Q&A, and I will take those. So I'll start with a question I posted in the chat. So one, thank you all for this conversation. I work in the STEM field currently, so I think this is a topic that does go unnoticed. So thank you for all your work. So the question is, when discussing controversial topics or hot topics per se, like cuts to STEM research funding, what strategies have you all found to help create meaningful dialogue with other students that really moves the students toward collaboration and progress?
I must admit that I was greatly aided by like a curriculum committee about people sitting down and thinking very deeply about the kind of questions to flow into it. But I think as far as like the actual skills that I like applied to get people to kind of be thinking in that way, um, I think there was something to just kind of understanding how something impacts you and then listening to the way it impacts everybody else. Like I think that's really the core to what made dialogue make people feel more connected like a community and actively kind of improve their skills for empathy and active listening was just listening and being able to see everybody's perspectives about how something impacts them. And if that's for cuts to STEM, people will have a lot more kind of like high emotions about it. But if everybody is approaching it in the perspective of like, this is how this thing affected me, then it's really tough to get angry at somebody, because I'm not making a claim about a truth or what that means in high value. I'm just saying this thing impacted me, and that's how I feel about it, which just feels honest.
No, that's great, Joey. Thank you so much. And something you said earlier, Joey, I wrote down and I have lost it. Oh, fear of conflict. You mentioned talking about the fear of conflict. So I'm interested for everyone on the panel of in today's society, what you're seeing on your campuses. What does that fear look like when it comes to entering a space to have dialogue?
I guess like personally coming from like again not having the chance to really have dialogue in a lot of my classes, I think the biggest like concern when you're jumping into something like that or into like talking about a controversial topic like is just genuinely like not knowing what other people expect from you. And I know I've like kind of said that and kind of hit that home, but like I feel like that is one of like the hardest parts of dialogue or of having these conversations. So like a lot of those topics, whether they have to do with current news, like how, specific things are happening, it's just personally, I think the best experience I've had in a topic like something like that was when um, Professor Ball was like, hey, like, let's not judge what other people are going to say. Like, let's all talk about this as a whole. Let's not project how we feel on other people, but rather just share what our opinions are and what our opinions are for ourselves rather than pushing what we believe and what we want onto other people, if that makes sense.
To add to that too, like I really can't emphasize enough how much like it's not just for dialogue. It's not just like the opinions that I encourage people to share, but the opinions and experiences that kind of informed them, right? And so for conflict, I feel like that's the biggest thing that separates dialogue from like debate and discussion. I always came in and I would try and like get people to think and put them in like in different boxes in their heads. It's like you're not in debate space. Please don't just tell me why you think something is true because of something you read online. I really like that's not what this is for. Like this is about for why you feel a certain way and why you think you feel a certain way. And so for conflict, there were plenty of times when people came in a bit more just wanting to just kind of rile folks up or try and do this kind of like debate, what's the word, like rally, back and forth with somebody. And most of the times that it happened, I noticed that it was just opinion sharing and just kind of like flat, just statements rather than something that really like kind of backed it up with their experience and emotions about it that kind of made it easier to empathize with them and them easier to empathize with everybody else. So whenever I noticed that, I would always be like, okay, please experiences. And most of the times that would like often address a lot. But sometimes there are just folks that can still be just as conflict heavy and in turn, kind of discourage everybody else who's generally conflict averse from really stepping up to have that conversation.
No, thanks, Joey. Andy has a question in the chat. And Andy, please feel free to unmute yourself if you're in a space that you can do that, but I will read your question out loud. One challenge I have faced in incorporating dialogue into a topical course like STEM or even humanities is that it easily turns into discussion, not a dialogue that engages self and involves deep listening. Discussion is a much more familiar dynamic, so people default to just sharing ideas, even if they are doing it collaboratively. What suggestions do you all have for helping conversations in STEM or other classrooms to move beyond discussion into dialogue? Great question, Andy. Thoughts from the panelists from a student perspective?
So I think like one of the things that's really important is kind of setting an expectation ahead of time of like what your main goal is. I think it is very difficult because sometimes there are students that don't want to have that dialogue, don't want to discuss like what they're learning, don't want to challenge each other, and that kind of falls negatively on the students who do. So I think as much as like I don't know if necessarily discussion, if it's about the topic, is a bad thing. You're still talking about it and you're still doing it, and I think you can like almost in a sense be like, hey, like I want you to come back to me with this and this and this and this afterwards. And I think like saying that I want you to do this and then you're going to have to tell me what you did afterwards helps keep students more engaged rather than just like, oh, like I'm just going to talk about it and then move on. Like I think it's very important to like kind of have that like situation, like kind of having a bunch of like small mini dialogues and then combining them into a larger one as a group, kind of fishbowl style in a way. And I think, pulling what people think is important from each group or each person, um, even if you're not necessarily using it in a typical dialogue sense, you can use it in a way to still benefit your students from what they're learning, what they're understanding, and then how it can then be like described, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I actually want to build because I was looking at Preya's comment, which was fantastic. So we want you to come back to what you're saying. But to Emily's comment, you can pick the type of dialogue you're doing. So the structure of the dialogue that really can keep people from just going into a rote behavior. And I think like some of these like fishbowl really helps with people who are engaged, other people getting to listen, and that can help, stay away from that. But also the crumble and commit where people write things down if they don't necessarily want to be the one who says it, and then you going ahead and having some of those careful questions. Like you don't have to just let it be a free-flowing dialogue sometimes. I see heads shaking, so what do you all think?
I was gonna say, I think how you phrase your questions is kind of what takes it from a discussion to a dialogue. And so if you see it getting into that discussion level, then asking those like, is there an experience in your life that caused you to feel that way or form that opinion? I think that helps get to that next level.
I also think just like I said before, being able to like list out debate, discussion, dialogue for folks just really helps to make a little mental note of like what this space is for and what the goals are. Discussion for me is like very goal oriented, like I always like broke it up as like debate is more of like a show of rhetoric and skill more than anything else. It's a sport. And then discussion is, okay, we're sitting together to try and come up to a single answer for this thing. And I'm like, we're not here for answers today. I don't think we have that that ability. But what we can do is, talk about it and like understand each other. And if that's like the fundamental like goal is just listening, then I feel like people will put a bit more effort into listening than if they're like, okay, I should listen for the answer.
Well, good thoughts. Andy, if that doesn't help, please feel free to keep probing and asking more questions. My next question for you all is how has this experience and what you've learned from this opportunity, like how does it show up to you in like your daily normal life? So Savannah, you mentioned like the GE experience. Like from what you've learned from this experience, do you feel like now you can like pivot or like probe more? Just curious from the group of like how does your body react like outside of environments like this when there's like dialogue that shows up in your space? Yeah, go ahead, Savannah.
Yeah, so back to my GE experience, it having an understanding of dialogue and effective communicating really shows you when you're in those certain spaces. I feel like it teaches you how to pull out certain information and start a specific conversation with someone. Let's say if I was sitting across from my boss and he was just giving me just words, not even full sentences, I would have the ability to either like create a conversation from that or speak in a way where he understands me and then I can finally get the information to understand him. So I feel like that's been really important outside of school, like showing that side of what I can do.
Ooh, I'd love to probe that. Like, do you feel like there's a different set of confidence you have going into those types of conversations? Or how does that show up for you, especially if you think about your future long-term goals?
So I I have confidence in being able to communicate in dialogue, but sometimes I get a little shy. And obviously, as an intern, you're working directly under someone and you want to make the best impression. So it definitely pushes you more because you want to make sure everything is perfect. Like whatever you're communicating is exactly what you want to say. But I do get a little shy. Like my confidence sometimes isn't always there, just depending on the crowd or the person that I'm speaking to.
That might have been my bad for asking you. Yes, totally understand the internship, get it. But also, I think that really helps you long term, right? For whatever future trajectory you've got. So thanks for sharing. Yeah,
I,
Priya, go
I,
ahead. Go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, Savannah says she's shy, and at times she is shy. But what I have noticed is that you're shaking your head at me already, I know, is that the skills when someone asks a question or things like that, she will just kind of wake up to that. So she's not someone who's going to say it right away to you, but as she sees something develop, I think she's gotten a lot more confidence to be like, "Hey, let me ask you this, or let me talk about this." Emily, I think the same thing. It's like there's a lot of people that feel shy or introverted that these skills help them say, "Well, I'm just using a skill and I'm just asking a question that leads to a better conversation."
And to kind of respond with using personal experience, I think Amanda would agree that I was like that a lot. She'd use the phrase, I'd wait till the water was warm to get in. And I've thought about that a lot. And that's something that when I'm entering new spaces, I think about. But even throughout my life, I feel like having the skills of like participating in dialogue and facilitating dialogue, it gives you this like way to tease out power dynamics and interactions in a way that sometimes, like when things don't feel good, you walk away and you're like, you can really think about why it didn't feel good, and then you can kind of like address that the next time it comes up. Um, I'm trying to speak abstractly. It would be easier with a example, but we're being recorded, and I can't quite invoke the what stays here or what's said here stays here. But I had a specific interaction with one of the deans at our school who, anytime you brought up a concern, would just hyperbolize what you said to delegitimize it. And the first few times that happened, I like it didn't feel good, but I couldn't figure it out. I'm like, I don't know what it is about this that's making me feel not heard. And then I think through having the skills of dialogue, you slowly tease it out. And I figured out that's what it was, that it feels like it's being hyperbolized and then delegitimized. And so over time, I've learned how to deal with that and only like so now my new strategy is like the whole when you say this it makes me feel this, right? That's like a very hard thing to fight back and get pushback on, but I think I wouldn't have figured out how to deal with that dynamic if I didn't have this years of dialogue practice to really like think about it and figure out how to address specific behaviors.
No, that's great. Oh, Joey, go ahead.
It definitely can echo like just the like amount that it helps just knowledge and comfortability with group dynamics and understanding how that stuff works, being part of teams, being in a group where, very informal and kind of like the tyranny of structurelessness kind of thing, right? Where, it's a huge group and we all have to decide something suddenly, and very little support from like any higher structures on how to format it. Being able to just kind of default to, oh, well, I've been in spaces where I've let people like this, and in ways where, I'm fairly comfortable that like I can handle if folks get into like conflict. That's really helped me manage a lot, especially in regards to like research stuff, because oh my God. Can people get, like there's conflicts that arise in any kind of like small or large group, that I feel like dialogue and seeing how people interacting with like the community and agreements have kind of informed a lot for me. Um, Along with just kind of being aware of like the facilitator mindset of like multi-partiality and how that kind of like extends to like any like systemic process that I'm a part of. Like if I'm put in charge of something, it's easy sometimes just to kind of like be part of the machine and just follow the things that you were told to do and just kind of like bust it out robotically. But I also try and like think like, okay, there is power dynamics here that I've now been kind of been slotted into, and kind of being aware of teasing those out, knowing how to address them in a kind of way, communication wise, and also just kind of also being able to communicate that to others as well is super helpful, because it's one thing just to realize stuff myself and hold these dynamics inside myself to make it easier to navigate social spaces, and then there is, oh no, I'm paralyzed because I can't really explain to somebody else how I feel about this thing, even though it's extremely clear in my head.
Thanks, everyone. I see no questions in the chat, but happy to ask another random one. I'm curious about community agreements, right? I think I can only speak for myself on this call. When I create community agreements in classroom spaces, outside of classroom spaces, it's like pulling teeth sometimes, or really getting students to think more critically of what those community agreements are. Any suggestions on like what are good, air quotes, community agreements that you have seen, and what are some that you'd be like, those are a little iffy?
It was definitely hard to get people to make them from scratch. I feel like, especially if you don't have much experience with dialogue, it kind of feels like a Herculean task just to to ask them to anticipate what kind of problems they'll have in that space. Maybe after like if they've been to mini dialogues before, we just have like a preset community agreements list that we have them agree to. Then they might be a little more informed than like how to do it. But I really liked the ones that I was given. I don't know who exactly made these in Change Baker's dialogue. Freya might know. But we had these like 10 here. It was the use I statements and avoid generalizations. What's said here stays here. Share airtime. Listen to understand, not respond. Listen harder when you disagree. Address the statement, not the person. Huge. Challenge yourself to enter a space of bravery, kind of like trying to kind of like work with that language of like safe spaces. Like it's not you're not going to feel comfortable all the time. You're going to need to kind of step a little bit outside your comfort zone and be willing to kind of be brave and explain what you believe. Speak your truth. Don't tell me what the person that you really respect believes. I want to know what you believe and how it's kind of been formed. And then last and not least, expect and accept non-closure. That one is just hard and necessary for me. There they are.
I appreciate Amanda for sharing them because when I came to my new institution and was putting a program together, I also used these, and that's kind of spread since then too. This feels relevant, but it wasn't a question that was asked, so I'm just going to ask the question and then answer it. One of the most surprising places that I've seen agreement show up in the STEM world is when we do case-based learning. Like we go in, we have a little group, and we had to form community agreements day one to kind of have a shared understanding of how we interacted with each other and really seeing the impact that had on feeling like you can admit when you don't know something or ask someone to repeat like a complicated mechanism again. And sometimes in medical school, it feels like everyone else knows what's going on and you don't, and it can really breed that kind of insecurity. And so seeing these community agreements help dismantle that in my case-based learning groups. It was really surprising, and I really found it effective in STEM in that way.
So let me enter in there because you actually made me think about something. We actually do teach people a lot of community guidelines in all sorts of classes without necessarily giving them, like, say, go do dialogue, right? It's usually community guidelines and active listening. And I think that's something to realize that it's even just doing that will enrich discussions, even if you're not going to focus on doing dialogue in class, right? So I think that that's a great point to talk about. Not everything has to be a part of whatever you're doing. Just be intentional and understand how you're using those things in those spaces, and that you may not get closure. It may not be a full piece. Okay, I have a question as we go into wrap up here. So these are kind of those, we've had this discussion, you've shared so much good stuff. Kind of maybe the hardest question of the day. What's your advice for instructors and professors in terms of getting out of their own way when it comes to using this stuff, right?
I want to say almost to start slow. Like it might feel like a huge change to like switch from like a lecture-based style to like a style where people are willing to like speak up or comment on something during it. Like I think even if it's broken down into small like agreements where you're like I want you guys to discuss this and bring it back to me. And then maybe the next class is a lecture style, and then like you go back and you do, okay, we lectured on this, now tell me your ideas. And I think that's one of the main things, or tell me what you don't understand, because I feel like that's a huge thing, especially here at Clarkson or in other STEM schools, is like you're expected to just know it after you saw it once, and that's not realistic. Like, so just being open to people asking you questions, even if it's like office hours, or like there you designate 10-15 minutes after class for questions, like for people just starting in those small ways where students are comfortable coming up to you and asking you like about a specific topic or what you think about this is a huge step, because here we don't always have that. So I think just, and maybe a lot of other STEM schools are the same way, I don't really know. But like just one small step at a time.
I'm going to take the easy route out and say to remain open-minded. I'm kind of biting off of Emily just a little bit, just because it is a new experience for the students as well as for you if this is like something you're doing for the first time. And I was kind of looking back at our community guidelines that Professor Ball set up. I was trying to find them. And I feel like something important is knowing where your opinion comes from, personal or learned. And I feel like that goes as well for professors and facilitators because it's very easy for you to get wrapped up in some of the conversations that are happening amongst like the students or your peers and stuff. And I wanted to say one more thing to, I think Samaya, it was you who had asked like certain things to add to community guidelines. And one of the things we have in ours is like rules can always be added just because you don't know, maybe you are missing something and it'll come up later. I feel like that's one of the most important things.
I think for me, it's very important just to kind of be aware of what you're trying to do. Like what are your goals of using dialogue? Like it's hard to really tell people that we use learning objectives in any kind of like serious sense of like a static thing that we want you to learn at the end. But I still think just directions of skills for people to develop in mind are pretty important to keep in mind when trying to make either a dialogic space or just kind of the questions you're going to use for them. Because, everything from how deep the topic goes to, how emotionally or politically like arousable it is will impact how people interact with it, which will impact the kind of skills they learn and the kinds of ways they interact with each other. So it's like in the same way that like it's kind of taking it slow sometimes to introduce people to dialogue, I think it's also being aware of how like every rule structure or topic can also inform the way that like they're going to act, and the way that they could develop certain skills in active listening and empathetic question asking and such.
That's fantastic. And if people are not paying attention, there's been some wonderful suggestions about QFT technique and a few other things in the chat. One of the things I wanted to make people aware of is we will be putting up resources as well because the students did actually make a brochure for their class. They were not required to do that. So we have that. And you've seen Manda posting a few of the resources that were created within her group as well. So we'll be putting up a few of these things so that you see some examples and you can use those. Absolutely, there were comments about critical thinking. You can rely on that too. Really good stuff. All right, so I'm going to ask this question that it's a little bit of a riff off of Amanda's question, is that if you've done the peer leadership of dialogue, how do you feel being a peer doing this for others? And then if you haven't been a peer dialogue leader, but you're thinking about yourself and how you feel like dialogue has really helped you think about being a leader and making this kind of dialogue discussion happen. Can you all give us some feedback on that?
I think a huge part of my leadership style is to be collaborative and include everyone along the way. And that means that there's going to be conflict. And so through doing dialogues and facilitating them, I feel like I'm really, I wouldn't say comfortable in that area of like expecting anything to be said or for conflict to arise. But I think knowing that like I have a structure or a set of ways that I can like later address the conflict and um, like help make sure that like each side feels heard. I think it makes me feel like I can be a better leader and include more because I'm not afraid of what will happen if a bunch of people get together and have competing ideas because I know how to kind of navigate that space better.
I think dialogue just really helped me in a lot of ways to like reframe what conflict meant, you know. It like it's as not being something to be inherently scared of, is not something that is like an emotional or physical harm to you, but it just is something that is hard sometimes. And just because it's hard doesn't mean that like, that it should be scary inherently, that it's can, have some pretty good results too, that you can understand people better, and that you can look at problems in different ways. Yeah, there was just so much during dialogues that I saw that kind of experience of when people went from talking to each other as, oh, you're somebody that disagrees with me, to you're like an acquaintance to a friend that I'm starting to understand better, and um I'm seeing you for the experiences and how they built the person in front of me rather than just like the symbol of opponent that is so often in like debate or whatever, right?
So this has been wonderful. I appreciate what everybody has shared. You actually just gave me a better answer to that question about, cuts in funding around STEM. I think if you rethink the cuts and the conflict in a different way, and it's problem solving, and how do we look at, developing good STEM, business, humanities-based solutions, those learned opinion ones. I forget I say that to you, Savannah. Is that really helps, I think about, okay, why is there a conflict and what is it that we're trying to solve, and how do we get past it to think about those cuts and then reforming a solution that overcomes it. Really important. So I just want to say we are putting the survey for this webinar in to the chat so that people can take that. And if we could put up the DDNRC resource page so that people can see our upcoming events and how to get in contact with people. And if anybody's interested in talking to presenters who were available today, feel free to contact the DDNRC and we will put you in contact with individuals. All right. But also look for the resources that'll go out with this webinar. So I just really want to thank our presenters, Emily, Freya, Joey, Savannah. That was fantastic. And I think there's a lot that even in this moment, you made me think more about, and things I want to change. And I really appreciated the comments because I think there were things that help to think about how to present this to other people who are new to it. So our next one will be April 9th, Approaches to Dialogue Across 3 Campuses. So you'll maybe notice a little theme here. We're trying to really give people some good context work at who's been doing what and what you can see. And feel free to follow us, contact us with our email. And I think that is where we're at for the day.
Or add, first of all, thank you, students, so much on behalf of the programming committee. This was wonderful. Just really gave so many gems. And again, the satisfaction, Amanda and Jen, and I'm sure so many of us who just feel the gratitude and warmth and the pride and seeing, students thrive and being able to give back in this way. So we really appreciate what you're doing in this webinar and for the community. And I'm sure that there were many listening ears who will take this information forward. So we really appreciate you for that. And we wanted to add one more. We have one more event. I don't have the title for it, but for those who are members of DDNRC, we will have another community of practice session coming in March. And as Jen mentioned, then the next full webinar is the one in April. So yeah, we really appreciate you. Is there anyone else, Christine, or anyone else from the committee who wanted to add anything?
The date for the community of practice, if you want to mark your calendar, is March 23rd. We'd love to see you there. Right now it's a mystery topic, but it's going to be interesting. And it's a less formal presentation where there's a little bit of start to the conversation and then plenty of time for people to have talk with each other about the issue that's being presented.
Yes, for any of you who may be new to DDNRC, we do have the biannual, right? That's every other year conference. And our next one will be in 2027. But at the rate that 2026 is going at this point, it may not be as far away as it seems. And as always, if there's anyone who would like to, volunteer to be involved in DDNRC, we welcome volunteers for helping on our committees. Right, and Jen, thank you so much for bringing these students, and I'm going to do my, thank you all.
And
And any final words? How about you end it?
I just say thank you to everybody, and just great insight from everyone. And for anybody who's new to dialogue, keep going. You're going to do a great job.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay. So thank you. Take care, everyone. This will be the end of our session.